Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Trinity College Dublin. Welcome to the Daniel O'Connell 250th anniversary symposium. My name is Patrick Geoghegan. I'm the director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, Trinity's Arts and Humanities Research Institute, and we're proud to be the organisers of this conference. And it's the first of a series of events that we're going to be running over the next 5 years as we build up to the winning of Catholic emancipation in 2029, the bicentenary of that, and Daniel O'Connell taking his seat in the British House of Commons in 1830, so the 200th anniversary of that in 2030. So a whole 5-year programme of events, and we are delighted that you are here for the opening session of the very first event. And the event is being filmed because we are going to make all of this available online afterwards, and we're going to build it into a series of digital educational packs for schools all across the island. And that was a commitment in the programme for government, and we're delighted to be involved in that. As I say, it's organised by the Trinity Long Room Hub. We have been honoured to be able to link in with some wonderful partners to make this conference what it is. The Bar of Ireland joined us, and we're delighted to have the Chief Justice and a number of distinguished barristers and judges taking part in the conference. Dublin Cemeteries Trust, which of course includes Glasnevin Cemetery, and O'Connell was so crucially involved in the founding of Glasnevin Cemetery, are joined with us. Diageo Ireland, which represents so many iconic brands and so many which have a direct connection with Daniel O'Connell. And for example, George Rowe succeeded Daniel O'Connell as Lord Mayor of Dublin, and of course Rowe & Co still exists today. And one of the key supporters of O'Connell in the 1830s and the 1840s was Edmund Smithick, who was one of his greatest colleagues and his man in Kilkenny during that time. And we are also honoured to be associated with the Daniel O'Connell Summer School, and that's running this year on the 29th and the 30th of August, and we're delighted that Professor Maurice Bric is joining us for this session today. We are honoured to have so many descendants and family members of the O'Connell family here today. In particular, I want to give a special mention to Sean O'Connell, who is over here, who I forgot to include in our programme, but who deserved a very special mention because he has provided incredible support over the past number of months. And he is working with Kieran O'Connor and New Decade TV on a new documentary feature on Daniel O'Connell. And if you're interested in getting involved with that, well, Kieran and Sean are the people to talk to. So I'm going to introduce all of our panelists individually in turn, but we're going to begin, well, actually, maybe before we begin, I'll point out the fire exits in the event of an emergency. So we have here and up there and there. We have bathrooms on this level. If you exit through that door, you don't have to go all the way up into the arts block. And also, if people could please put their phones on silent. But before I introduce the panel, I'm hugely honoured to be able to welcome Johnny Cunningham to speak about his reflections of the Liberator and his reflections on his grandfather. And Johnny is a direct descendant of Daniel O'Connell, and he's here to give us all a welcome on behalf of the O'Connell family.
Thank you, Patrick. Hello, everybody. I'm Johnny Cunningham, and I am a great grandson of Daniel O'Connell. On my mother's side, Ricardo O'Connell. I'm joined here today by my sisters Emily and Ricardo, my sons Stephen and Paul, and my grandsons Chris, Killian, and my granddaughter Holly. And not to forget my wife, Natalie. Also here are my first cousins, Maurice, Susanna, and Daniel. Like myself, all of them are either 3 greats, 4 greats, or 5 greats from Daniel O'Connell. I'm incredibly proud to be a descendant of Daniel O'Connell and honoured to be speaking at the 250th anniversary of his birth. I particularly admire his personality, wit, eloquence, and style. I would like to share a few stories with you about the Liberator that we grew up with. Take this moment when he was first elected to the House of Commons. He refused to sign the required oaths of allegiance and supremacy. These, in effect, made it impossible for a Catholic to take a seat in Westminster. He said, "I at once reject this declaration. Part of it I believe to be untrue, and the rest I know to be false." That act of defiance kept him out of Parliament for 2 more years until the oaths were amended. He put conviction before ambition, a remarkable stance. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, as most of you know, just a couple of years later, he led his 3 sons and 2 sons-in-law, all newly elected, into Parliament at Westminster. Just imagine, 6 of the O'Connell family marching into the House of Commons. What a spectacle it must have been. A difficult sight, I would imagine, from a UK politician's point of view. He was a fierce Irish nationalist, a flamboyant orator, and champion of civil rights. As a Catholic from Ireland, a small island on the edge of Europe, he took on the might of the British Parliament for 17 years, an extraordinary feat. Even William Gladstone called him the greatest popular leader the world has ever seen. Today, he's mentioned alongside Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela. There's been a great deal written about Daniel O'Connell, the barrister and politician, but I find myself more drawn to Daniel O'Connell, the man. I can't help but notice a few personality traits we might share. Carriage accidents and a fondness for shopping come to mind. He was travelling in his carriage on the way to Dublin with his brother James on a track above Kells Bay when the horses suddenly bolted. Both men had to leap from the carriage before it overturned. Daniel emerged unscathed, but his brother wasn't so lucky. He suffered a broken collarbone, a fractured rib, and a fractured arm and several broken ribs. It was many hours before a doctor arrived from Clonlorgan, during which time James lay injured on the track. His wife Mary was not always delighted with his spending habits, much like my own wife Natalie. O'Connell could never settle for buying just one item. He had to buy the lot. I must admit, I see myself in that trait. More than once, I found myself in the shop, eyeing a few things with interest, only for Natalie to quietly whisper, "Daniel O'Connell." Gentle nudge was all it took. I would drop them like a hot potato and move on. As for his fondness for shopping, he decided to buy a carriage for £500, a huge sum at the time. He assured Mary it was a magnificent carriage, yellow in colour with blue mountings, extremely comfortable seats, and in perfect condition. He was convinced she'd love it. Her response? She told him to take a hike. She certainly didn't like the colours, and it was far too expensive. In the end, they bought one for £350. On another occasion, he wrote to Mary and told her that he had just bought 2 thirsts of whiskey at a great price. A thirst, for those of you who don't know, is a barrel of whiskey containing 42 gallons. Mary had a canary, wondering what they would do with 84 gallons of whiskey. He told her not to worry, they would throw a few parties. But just think about it, 84 gallons of whiskey. Mary was right. He would have to throw about 100 parties. As a pastime, Daniel kept a pack of beagles at Derrynane. He absolutely loved beagling in the hills above his home, especially in Geoghegan mountain. He'd often go up there with his friends. He'd sit on a grassy ditch overlooking the valley, with Daniel and Lamb's Head in the foreground, the Beara Peninsula and Bull Rock in the distance, Derrynane Bay shimmering below with Scariff and Deeny Islands nearby, and over his right shoulder, Skellig would complete the picture. He adored this pastime. Just in front of him, he'd watch the pack of beagles spread out, darting from gorse bush to hedge, in a constantly changing spectacle, each one searching to raise a hair. Then suddenly, one hound would give tongue, then another, and soon the whole pack would erupt in chaos, dashing off over ditches and hedges. The sound echoing through the valley, thrilling and wild, with Daniel running after them. I think O'Connell would have been very proud of his descendants. In particular, I would like to mention my granddad, Captain Maurice Charles O'Connell, known locally around Derrynane as the Captain. He was O'Connell's great-grandson. He was brought up in Derrynane and named heir by his uncle, Deaf Dan, who had 5 daughters and no son. So my grandfather spent his time managing the farm. Unbelievably, the farm was all that was left after the various land acts decimated the estate of about 30,000 acres. In 1915, encouraged by John Redmond, who called for Irishmen to support the war effort, my grandfather joined the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, which came under the umbrella of the Northumberland Fusiliers. His regiment was called the Tyneside Irish. He went into battle on the first day of the Somme offensive in 1916. His battalion suffered heavily. The numbers are shocking. Only 90 men remained from over 1,000. Not one other officer survived. That evening, he reported to his general, whose name was Inglesby Williams. Inky Bill was his nickname. Inky Bill ordered him to go over the top again the next morning and told him there may be a Victoria Cross in it for him. My grandfather told him that he had 1/10 of his men left and it would mean certain death for all of them. Inky Bill said that a posthumous Victoria Cross was not to be sniffed at. An amazing statement. My grandfather's reply was simple and brave. Then I'll say goodbye. During the advance the next day, he was shot and got shrapnel in his leg. It was his lucky day, he said afterwards. It sure was our lucky day. None of us would be here today had it not been for that shrapnel. He spent the next week in the medical tent fighting off the doctors who wanted to amputate his leg. He still had the shrapnel in his leg when he died, aged 83. After recuperation at home in Ireland, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and was posted to take charge of a prisoner of war camp in France. He recounted how he was not getting any cooperation from the German prisoners. One day, a gypsy caravan passed, dragging a dog along the ground behind one of the carts. He went out with a few soldiers and brought the dog back into the camp. It was a German Alsatian. Once the Alsatian had recovered, my grandfather noticed a remarkable change. The German prisoners suddenly became far more cooperative. It seems that even in wartime, a dog could still win hearts and change minds. Patrick Geoghegan once shared a fascinating story about the Ennis election in 1828. He explained how back then it was common practice for landlords and business owners to dictate to their tenants and employees how they should vote. Coercion was the norm. Fast forward 131 years, and it seems little had changed. It was June 17, 1959, the day of the presidential election between Eamon de Valera and Sean McKeown. On a farm called Colina, between Skibbereen and Baltimore, my grandfather had lined up his farmhands and informed him that he'd be driving them to the polling station himself. Then he added, quite matter-of-factly, that he would be standing beside each of them as they cast their vote. Yeah. And if any of them dared vote for De Valera, they'd be out of a job. Some traditions, it seems, die hard. Roll on 8 years to August 1967, and everything has changed. We find ourselves in the forecourt of Derrynane House, gathered for the official opening and handing over of the estate to the Irish government. The house had been very expensive to heat and maintain. It was large, unwieldy, and in a great need of repair. My grandfather and the Derrynane Trust had spent many years trying to raise funds to secure its future. Standing on the podium was none other than President Eamon de Valera. In front of him, seated in neat rows, were about 100 invited guests, my grandparents among them, along with my parents and other distinguished figures. The scene was solemn, historic, and emotional. It struck me how time has a way of changing one's outlook. Only a few years before, in a farmyard in the neighbouring county, de Valera's name was being muttered under breath by my grandfather. Now here he was, towering in stature, the symbolic heir to O'Connell's legacy, presiding over the handover of the Liberator's home. President de Valera spoke about how he was now happy to pay tribute to Daniel O'Connell, because heretofore he and his fellows did not give him due credit for his achievements. This was when I meant everything has changed, because my grandfather was sitting in the front row a few feet from the president. He had a smirk on his face, and I'm sure he was saying to himself, "That's all right, Dev, I forgive you. Sure, haven't you taken this liability off my shoulders?" In our house, there were many Sunday lunch discussions about the fate of Derrynane House with young ears listening. On one occasion, there was a discussion about an approach that was made to Billy Butlin. I really fancied Butlins at the time, but what a lucky escape. If the O'Connells had not handed over Derrynane, I'm sure they would have muddled through. But personally, since then, I would like to acknowledge successive governments, successive OPWs, and most of all, successive staffs for making Derrynane the place that it is now. I understand that it's the most visited property in Kerry these days. They should all be very proud of themselves. As children, my mother continuously ingrained in us the importance of Daniel O'Connell. During my school years, there was nothing taught about him. However, over the past 20 years, he has been celebrated on the international stage. Finally, I have been amazed and sometimes overwhelmed by the amount of knowledge that people of all nationalities have about him, and I have learned something new on each occasion. So here today, I am putting all of the speakers to follow under pressure to tell me something new. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
That was brilliant. That was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I couldn't think of a better way of kicking off our conference today. And Johnny mentioned various governments over the year, and we've been very fortunate to have had such wonderful support from our government, not only for this conference, but for a whole series of Daniel O'Connell commemorative events this year. And we're very grateful to have the Taoiseach Micheál Martin coming to speak to us here tonight at 6 o'clock. We're delighted to have had the wonderful support of the Minister for Culture, Communications and Sport, Minister Patrick Donovan, the Expert Commemoration Advisory Committee chaired by Brian Dobson, and Brian Dobson will be here this evening as well. And really just wonderful to see such support for O'Connell commemorative events taking place around Ireland this year, but also events that are being planned over the next 5 years. And I think it really shows the significance of the anniversaries, not only this year, but over the next 5 years as well. We have a brilliant opening panel, and we spent a lot of time deciding how we would arrange this opening panel. And I was clear from the very start that I thought there was only one academic who should kick off our panel, and that is Professor Maurice Bric. Emeritus Professor of History at UCD and Director of the Daniel O'Connell Summer School, because I think Maurice, more than any other living academic, has done more to champion O'Connell and keep his ideals and his messages alive through his work, through his scholarship, through his teaching, through his various endeavours, and crucially, through that brilliant work of the Daniel O'Connell Summer School. And we are so honoured to be organising this conference in association with that summer school, and we are so privileged to be able to call upon Professor Maurice Bric to talk to us about Daniel O'Connell, Citizen of the World.
Thank you, Patrick. My mother used to have a saying when people started to get extravagant in the way in which they talked about other people, would you mind opening the door to leave out the squall? So I feel a little bit like that having listened to Patrick's introduction of me. But anyway, I've been allotted 15 minutes or so to talk about O'Connell and about the impact he made on not only on the Ireland of his time, but on subsequent generations. And I'd like to begin my 15 minutes or so by just remembering a time when Catholic emancipation was never talked about before there was ever such a person as Daniel O'Connell, the Liberator, and remind myself that for about 350 years before all that, the O'Connells were actually quite a dominant political force in South Kerry. First of all, as clients of the McCarthy Moors, and thereafter in their own right. And that was a hegemony which they continued to exercise until the middle of the 17th century. They exercised that dominion from a place called Ballycarbery Castle, which some of you may know is about 2 miles to the northwest of Carsaveen, which incidentally in the 19th century was a town which was developed by another branch of the O'Connells, the later O'Connells, as indeed it was by Trinity College, who were the landowners of the area until the beginning of the 20th century. That domination by the O'Connells for that period between the 13th and the 17th century is actually quite important. And it has always sort of fascinated me that despite the twists and turns and complicated politics of especially 16th century Munster, that they managed to survive in Ballycarbery. And even on 2 occasions during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, they exercised the office, or they held the office of High Sheriff of County Kerry, which of course, as you may know, is the very symbol of royal authority of the Crown, while at the same time practicing their Catholic religion. However, by the time Cromwell came to power in the 1640s, the O'Connells of Ballycarbery had, to coin a phrase, no cards to play. And instead, the loyalty to the Crown counted for nothing. Loyalty to the Catholic religion counted for nothing. At that time, the Cromwellian order had a very specific idea of who should be treated under its new regime. And so, therefore, the O'Connells became suspect and were eventually ousted from Ballycarbery Castle in 1652 after the fall of Limerick to the Cromwellian army in October 1651. So the Cromwellian army, as I said, reduced Ballycarbery Castle to ruin. It is even today, those of you who know that part of the world, it is still even an impressive ruin, several hundred years afterwards. The eldest of the O'Connells at that time was a man called Maurice O'Connell, and he, being the eldest, was transported to County Clare. But the second, John, established himself in Derrynane, and it was in Derrynane and from Derrynane that the O'Connells began to regroup and began to reinvent themselves during the subsequent centuries. Incidentally, I should add that Derrynane at that time, in the 1650s, right until the middle of the 19th century, was not owned by the O'Connells, something which is very often forgotten. It was actually held on lease from the Earls of Cork until it was eventually bought out by the O'Connells in the 1850s. For all that, however, and for all their reinvention in Derrynane, the O'Connells never forgot Ballycarbery. And indeed, when Catholic emancipation came to be discussed and eventually to become law in April 1829, Daniel O'Connell was heard to say that it signalled not only the end of the penal laws, but a second coming of his family as a political force in Kerry. And moreover, he made it clear that if any of the existing gentry and in particular those who had settled in Kerry during the plantations, if they wanted to engage with his new form of politics, they could do so only by deference to him. And indeed, when Ballycarbery Castle and its environs came on the market during the 1860s, by way of the encumbered estates courts, the O'Connells retrieved, as they put it, from Ballycarbery Castle, and it remained in the branch of the Lakeview O'Connells until the Land Act of 1903. I don't want to call it as a trophy estate, but they brought it back simply to kind of square that version, that license of their history. However, having said all that, the fall of Ballycarbery, as I've mentioned, and the reinvention of the O'Connells in Derrynane established Derrynane as a busy hub of international commerce, some of which, as you know, was driven by a thriving culture of smuggling with their kith and kin in Catholic France and in Catholic Spain in particular. However, that trade to one side and the smuggling to one side, thanks to the penal laws, families like the O'Connells had no reason to identify with the old Irish Parliament in College Green or with its political establishment, the so-called Protestant ascendancy. And so they looked to the so-called wild geese of Catholic Europe, and through them invented their own diaspora, their own world, their own, I won't call it ascendancy, but their own world, so to speak. A world that was driven not by the old Irish Parliament in College Green, as I've mentioned, but by an invented Irish Catholic diaspora. And so therefore, when the penal laws were repealed from the 1770s onwards, and Catholic emancipation came to be discussed, the challenge was firstly, how to shoehorn such a culture, which had its own historical ways of looking at the world, how to shoehorn that culture with its own historical and family references in Madrid, Lisbon, Paris, Vienna, and the various points in Catholic Europe, how to shoehorn such a community into the existing state. Secondly, how to get that Irish Catholic community informally, as well as a matter of law, how to get that community to identify with the state, how to identify with the Protestant ascendancy, from which, as I mentioned, it had been kept at arm's length and excluded for many years. And finally, from the other side of the coin, so to speak, how far was that state, that ascendancy, and that established church, how far was it willing to go to involve Catholics in shaping and voting on the laws of the land? For his part, as you may know, King George IV had his answer. Very, very little. And as a result, when George was asked to sign the instrument of Catholic emancipation into law in April 1829, he hesitated. Because as he saw it, he was being asked to accept that emancipated Catholics, as they were called, could ignore their private religious beliefs and legislate for a country as a whole, and not use their newfound status to undermine the established church and state. While O'Connell appreciated that wars had been fought for less, he suggested, as did the Duke of Wellington, who of course was Prime Minister at the time, that such arguments were no longer tenable. If only because, as he saw it, perhaps after reading the arguments of the Founding Fathers, of which he was an avid reader, that there was, after all, such a thing as dual loyalty. Loyalty to a church and loyalty to the state, and that each of these could coexist happily with the other, and that at that time, and for all the historical baggage of the past, that at least from a constitutional point of view, Catholics could be true and loyal citizens of the state, and that they could also serve that state with generosity and with commitment, even allowing for the fact that the head of that state was also the head of a church with whose theology and ethos they didn't agree. And so, Mr. Chairman, Catholic emancipation was not just a concession to Catholics, as it is often described. It represented a fundamental reshaping of the constitutional character of British citizenship. However, all of this had been achieved by dint of another radical development, what is often termed people power, as overseen by the Catholic Association. Founded in 1823, this association consisted of an interacting web of networks at parish, county, province, and finally at national level. As I'm sure many of you know, the so-called People's Treasury was then funded by a Catholic rent, which varied from as little as a penny a month to a guinea for the better off. But these two characteristics also suggested an important another point, and it is this, that it combined, and it's a wonderful word often used in the 18th and 19th century, it combined O'Connell's followers, high and low, urban and rural, rich and poor, into an interdependent popular movement which was driven not by militancy, but by the moral authority of an awakened democracy. And as a result, if I may quote from a newspaper at the time, we see here in progress a revolution. Without violation of any law, without the oppression of any law, without the oppression of any individual, without rapine, desolation, or bloodshed. But instead we see a peaceful and constitutional revolution by the people themselves and with their own means and their own capabilities as the engine. For his part, the Duke of Wellington also appreciated this and the dangers that it had proposed to established politics. And so as part of it, the price of Catholic emancipation, he insisted that the Catholic Association should be disbanded. As he saw it, nobody should have any cause to think that a movement which had been spearheaded outside of Parliament, and at that by a Catholic, that such a movement had forced the government to introduce such a fundamental constitutional change as Catholic emancipation, even if in truth this had been the case. But what Wellington did not recognize, and this truly, truly dismayed O'Connell, what Wellington did not recognize was that the Catholic Association was more than a movement to bring about Catholic emancipation. It was more than an agitator for Catholic emancipation. Because for O'Connell, the wider and crucial point was that after generations of concluding that Westminster and the politics of Westminster had no relevance for the Catholics of Ireland, the Catholic Association had finally encouraged them to look to Parliament to redress its grievances, and to do so within the law and by peaceful agitation, and by extension to shun violence and what is often referred to as the white boy tradition. Now, the White Boys, as some of you may know, had existed under various names since the 1760s as a popular movement to abolish tithe and to reform the land system. Now, if only because such groups did not balk at the use of violence as a political weapon, O'Connell was very wary of the White Boys. And I suppose there's no surprise in saying that. But it should also be added that both before and after emancipation, that O'Connell defended several white boys on charges of everything from conspiracy against the state, as it was called, to the murder of officers and of the court, most notably perhaps at Carrickshock in December 1831 and in Tralee in 1832. That said, however, O'Connell always advised his followers that they had more to gain by agitating together as a collective force and within the law, and that his campaigns would prove this. But he also had another reason for wanting to marginalize the White Boys. And he believed that if they were not reined in under his leadership, that they could compromise his standing and power as a political actor and by extension the effectiveness of his campaigns in Westminster. And so as a result, O'Connell tried to absorb White Boyism and violent protest within the Catholic Association itself, and therefore to blunt its potential as a counterpower to him, so to speak. And indeed, towards that end, he used the Catholic clergy not only to collect the Catholic rent, but to control those whom O'Connell believed should be led rather than lead. But this white boy underbelly never went away, to coin a phrase. But because the Catholic Association embodied what was often seen as two mutually exclusive ways of expressing protest, the constitutional and the violent, it was an uneasy coalition which as a type continues into our own time. For all that, however, O'Connell appreciated that if he was to keep that coalition intact, it was not enough to condemn white boyism or their modus operandi. It was not enough either to contend their violence. He also had to make a convincing case as to why his way was the better way. And in that regard, he had to look to the British government as well as to himself. And the response was not always encouraging, to say the least. For example, during a public debate which took place in Dublin in November 1832 on the Irish Reform Bill of that year, O'Connell had to accept that it was a tamer proposal than its English and Scottish counterparts, and that as such, under the Irish Reform Act at least, Ireland would not gain as much as the two other parliaments, as the two other areas. And so therefore he was dismayed by that. And so as a result, what had been intended as a meeting about reform in Parliament led to a motion to repeal the Act of Union itself, and as such to an acceptance that the government had no cordiality of intention, as he put it, when it came to Ireland. This led O'Connell to refer again to the American revolutionaries of 1776, many of whom indeed believed, at least as O'Connell saw it, that their original revolution in 1776 had been driven, at least initially, less by a desire to break away from Britain than by the failure of Westminster to listen to their grievances. And this because, as he put it, Westminster had lost its political virtue, to use the word of the time. It had lost its political virtue, and therefore, as a result, went on to lose its first empire. And as he saw it, Britain was now on the point of doing exactly the same thing, of losing its second empire, which was beginning to develop, or at least, to use that great word, discombobulating it. I love that word, discombobulating the second British Empire, and for exactly the same reasons. And so therefore, as a result, O'Connell's rhetoric became increasingly laced by references to political virtue, and by extension to the argument that if the Second British Empire wanted to present itself as a new force of progress in the world, and by default, to quote Linda Colley, to rebut American pretensions of superior freedoms, then it could no longer look backwards towards the future. This was also as true of how he presented his case of Ireland during the 1830s and 1840s, as was his call for the redress of what he often called the mischiefs in India, Australia, and Canada, or the abolition of slavery, for which for O'Connell was not only a vile institution, but one which regarded certain people as having no humanity. All these matters were cut from the same cloth in O'Connell's view. Moreover, when it came to Ireland, while his arguments drew on Irish history and the peculiar circumstances of Ireland itself, they also encouraged a new type of humanitarian language which transcended place, class, creed, and colour, and as Johnny mentioned, found its way into the rhetoric of people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. So did his contributions to the debates on liberalism and absolutism in contemporary Europe, for which he is still remembered as a pioneering voice, as an influential voice in the development of contemporary European Christian democracy. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is at least part of his legacy, part of his inspiration, as well as the notion that in a world which hovered, as it still does, between violence and peaceful agitation, reform did not, in his view, reform did not necessitate revolution. But that, O'Connell argued, was as much a challenge for the Parliament and the institutions of the state as it was for the democracies whom they served. And so it remains today. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Professor Mary McAuliffe from UCD. I'm a UCD graduate who ended up working in Trinity, and Mary is a Trinity graduate who ended up working in UCD. And she has an incredibly distinguished Trinity history, and including through her uncle, the wonderful late poet Brendan Kennelly. And Mary is an historian. She's Director of Gender Studies at UCD. For many years, she has been a guest of mine on Talking History on News Talk, and she has always brought the subject to life. She has always been such a brilliant and passionate speaker, whatever she is speaking about. She is also from Kerry, and for all of those reasons, I thought I had to have her on the panel for our Daniel O'Connell conference, and she always brings such wonderful insights. And I think today, we couldn't have a conference without also mentioning Daniel's great wife and partner in so many of the endeavours, Mary O'Connell. And I think Mary is going to talk to us about Mary O'Connell and about some of these other related issues. So Professor Mary McAuliffe.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that introduction, Patrick. Yes, a very happy Kerry woman today. and delighted to be here with you to speak about Mary O'Connell, because of course many facets of Daniel O'Connell's life and legacy will be discussed here today. But as a gender historian, I often look at the issues of women in any subject I am studying, and using that lens to look at the subject. So I'm honoured to speak about the person who was at the centre of his heart, his life and his home for most of his adult life, and that of course was his wife, Mary. In 1802, Daniel and Mary married in secret in Dublin. Despite being distant cousins, Daniel's family, especially his uncle, Maurice Hunting Cap O'Connell, the owner of Derrynan, or as we found out today, the tenant of Derrynan, would not and did not approve. Daniel's position as heir to Maurice was in jeopardy because of the marriage, and until close to the birth of their first son, Maurice, named after Hunting Cap, I suppose, to try and appease him, the marriage was secret to a small circle of friends and family. And the question is, why? Why was Mary not acceptable? Mary O'Dowd and Maria Luddy have written about marriage in Ireland from 1600 to 1925, and their research demonstrates for both the landowning Anglo-Irish aristocracy and the growing Catholic middle class, minor gentry, I suppose, the importance of dowries, the importance of land to the status of women and men during this period. So the dowry was central to this. Luddy and O'Dowd look at how and why particular marriage partners were chosen. Religious beliefs, obviously, was one element in choosing a partner. Individuals and families were also influenced by other criteria, including, most importantly, the economic and social status of the potential partner. In their work, they look at the courtship and marriage of Mary and Daniel as one of the ways to marriage, probably one of the more unusual ways. And excuse me for using the Daniel and Mary, but I feel saying O'Connell and O'Connell would be a bit complicated throughout. Unusually, Daniel courted Mary in secret, meeting her in the neutral space of the city rather than incur the wrath of his uncle through meeting her in Kerry. Explaining this, he wrote, and I quote, "I would have many more opportunities of seeing and conversing with you than in the prying, curious, busy town of Tralee." Despite the need for secrecy, some members of the family were brought in to the courtship. This included her mother and her sister, who were quite supportive. As Luddy and O'Dowd outline, Mary's sister and brother-in-law conveyed letters between the couple. All this was necessary as there would be emotional, familial and financial repercussions for the couple. And as Luddy and O'Dowd write, and I quote, "Maurice O'Connell punished his nephew for his secret courtship and marriage by dividing his inheritance, initially intended solely for Daniel, between him and his brother, with dire consequences for the financial status of Daniel's growing family." Despite all of this secrecy and all of this potential hardship, and indeed actual hardship in the end, research on the couple shows a deep and meaningful love between them. Their surviving correspondence also indicates this. Mary O'Connell's biographer, Erin Bric, indicates that she discovered over 1,000 letters between the couple, some which were already in the public domain, but about 176 which were never published before that she found herself. In talking about Mary, most biographers and historians of Daniel indicate that she was actually a good match for him, and that she was, according to, for example, Dudley Edwards, probably the most stabilising influence on his career. Other historians like Michael McDonough talk about the fact that his domestic life was supremely happy, and there was always peace and sunshine in his home, and the love of a devoted wife. Fergus O'Farrell says Mary was intelligent, perceptive and understanding, and gave to O'Connell enormous praise and support, and that she was crucial for him, particularly perhaps the only human being whom, O'Farrell says, in whom he could confide almost totally his misgivings, vanities, triumphs and defeats. However, as Erin Bishop says, most of these historians look at Mary through the lens of her husband's life and work, through her role simply as his wife, not as a person in and of herself. There is no doubt that she truly loved Daniel and Daniel truly loved her, that they were attracted to one another. There were a lot of pregnancies, that they enjoyed each other's company, that they expressed love through the many, many letters that they wrote to each other over the decades. And I'll quote just one here from Daniel to Mary. I have received many letters from you, and you certainly cannot conceive what pleasure they afford me, my sweet, my delightful darling. You are my comfort and soother of my cares. My love, you are dearer to my heart than ever any woman was to man. Daniel, and indeed Mary, sacrificed money and material wealth for love, even if they both, as Bishop again points out, agreed that material wealth was as important as emotional support for a successful marriage. And we can see this when later on, ironically, they tried to make advantageous marriages for their own children and looked for dowries for intended partners for their sons and were anxious about providing dowries for their daughters to make marriage. Despite all of this, they married in secret and endured the disapproval of his family. But who was this Mary O'Connell that Daniel gave up much for? And who was she to give up much for Daniel and indeed endure the disapproval? Why did Daniel take such steps to ensure that they would be married and that they would have a life together despite all repercussions? Mary was actually also an O'Connell, was born in September 1778 in Tralee, County Kerry. Her father, Thomas, was a doctor and a member of the Church of Ireland, and her mother, Ellen Atuhi, was a Catholic. As it was common at the time, in mixed marriages, the girls were brought up in the faith of their mother. So Mary was a Catholic. The Tralee Mary was born into was a thriving town with many new businesses starting based on the port, particularly the grain trade, which brought wealth and prosperity to the town. And as a physician, Thomas O'Connell would have been able to provide financially for his children. However, he died when Mary was a young child, just 7 years old. He died in 1785. This was when the family fell into financial difficulty, these difficulties that would be the obstacle to her relationship with Daniel. It's not known how Daniel and Mary met, but it's quite possible it was one of the social events surrounding the times that Daniel was in Tralee for the assizes. He was, of course, at that time a young lawyer on the circuit, a young barrister riding from assize town to assize town. And there is no doubt that it would have been in Tralee as he was part of the Kerry circuit. There's also the fact that the families were distantly related, so he is possibly introduced to Mary at some social event as her distant cousin. There was even a more direct connection. His sometime co-counsel, James Connor, was married to Mary's sister, Betsy. So all these connections and associations conspired to bring the couple together. However they did meet, we know that in the summer of 1800, they began a clandestine correspondence and relationship. From the beginning, it was obvious that Daniel had real and deep feelings for Mary, which do seem to have been reciprocated. But the need for secrecy was paramount. He wrote to her, "Believe me, my sweet Mary, I really and truly love you, and I am anxiously await the moment of convincing you of my sincere and fixed regard for you. Yes, my sweet love, you know that it is not in my power to publish my situation or call on you in the face of the world for a return of regard." However, he still desired for them to be together, and Mary agreed to keep the correspondence secret, and their relationship continued and grew. Eventually, they married in 1802 in Dublin and managed to keep the marriage secret until Mary got pregnant in 1803. Daniel was right in his reasoning that his uncle, Maurice Huntingcap O'Connell of Derrynane, from whom he expected a large inheritance, would not be happy with his marriage, and indeed he was not. However, despite the disapproval of family members, Mary was eventually accepted by Daniel's parents, and she gave birth to a number of her children at the old O'Connell house outside of Cahersiveen. She and Daniel had a long, fruitful, and it would seem, happy marriage together. It was not, however, an easy marriage for Mary particularly. In the early years, as her husband concentrated on building his legal and political career, there were long separations. Luckily for the historian, because of these separations, we have these volumes of letters between the pair, which give us an insight into the relationship. into their concerns, into their feelings for one another, and into the life of a middle-class Catholic woman in the early 19th century. Unlike many women whom we write about in the history books, Mary was not a particularly political woman, not publicly at least. She was not a member of a community of nuns who were running hospitals or asylums. She was not involved in sex work or prostitution. She was not involved in politics. She was not a feminist. She did not concern herself with any other matters except the domestic, as was expected of a woman of her status and standing. However, the letters do give us an insight on what it was like to be a woman married to a public figure. As a supportive wife, Mary ran the house. She gave birth to 12 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. Between 1805 and 1810, she was pregnant almost every year. In fact, she gave birth to 2 children in 1 year, one early in February and one in December. Between 1812 and 1816, she had 5 more pregnancies, only one of which, her youngest child, Daniel Jr., survived to adulthood. Anyone who knows Daniel O'Connell's history knows of his financial difficulties, and these, of course, impacted on the domestic as well as on his public life. In 1809, he bought that house on Merrion Square, despite the fact that financially he couldn't really afford it, and perhaps his direct descendant gives us an explanation about the fact that he bought what he saw and what he wanted. Mary wasn't so flahuluk, as they say in Kerry, with money. The lectures from Mary often indicate her frustration at the fact that he kept sending people her way to stay with her, that as a public figure he was supposed to entertain guests at his home, and as a man brought up in what was still a fairly Gaelic tradition of hospitality, he did expect his wife would entertain. On what money? All of this led to the frustration from Mary and financial difficulty for the family. These financial difficulties were a cause of concern, and Mary had to manage the family finances and stretch those pounds, shillings and pence. 5 sons were educated at Clongowes Woods, and daughters for whom dowries would be a necessity if they were to make advantageous marriages. The letters between them indicate that Mary was careful with money. She disapproved of the purchase of the house at Merrion Square, was aware of prices and economic changes, expected value for money, and kept detailed financial accounts of her spending. You can see in the letters, they talk about how many servants they should keep in the house. She was anxious to keep the number low. She could run the house with a certain number, and she persuaded Daniel to try and cut back. From 1815 to 1830, of course, his finances were in dire straits because of bad investments, and Mary had to run the household under these straitened circumstances, including residing in France for 2 years in 1822 to 1824, which was deemed cheaper since they would not have to entertain on a scale expected as if they were in Merrion Square. In 1825, Mary returned as Daniel had inherited Derrynane, and she went there with the family, and she was the one who oversaw the renovations there. And now that house we see today is the house she effectively created during those renovations. It turned out that going to Derrynane wasn't as financially a good thing because, of course, they spent a whole pile of money on the renovations. Her main role, however, was the growing family, and the letters indicate a loving and united family. She oversaw the educational and religious development of the children, the boys until they went to Clongowes Woods, and the girls in preparation for marriage and domesticity. Interestingly, a number of her daughters attended a school in Dublin run by a Mrs. Bishop, whom we know from the letters Mary didn't particularly like. Mrs. Bishop was actually Eliza Wollstonecraft Bishop, a sister of the feminist and writer Mary Wollstonecraft. Bishop had suffered abuse from her husband, and she and Mary, her sister, had fled the house with her newborn baby in 1783. Unfortunately, the child died, but the damage to her reputation meant that Eliza Bishop was never able to remarry and spent most of her life impoverished, an indication of how badly a marriage could go in that period of time as well. Writers on Mary Wollstonecraft see the sisters' flight as a crucial moment in Wollstonecraft's emancipation ideas of emancipation from male authority. However, having no money, it meant the sisters had to work, and middle-class women worked in education. Bishop set up the school in Dublin, and Mary Wollstonecraft got a job as a governess in Dublin. It's one of the reasons why Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her book, A Vindication on the Rights of Women, and why she wrote of the unequal relationships between men and women, including in marriage. Despite her dislike of Mrs. Bishop, the O'Connell girls remained under her educational auspices for a number of years. And I suppose here we have an example of how a bad marriage could impact so adversely on the life of a woman of that period. But Mary O'Connell did not have a bad marriage. She had a stressful one on occasion, but it was a very good marriage. Erin Bishop, her biographer, states that she had intended to explore the themes central to one woman's life in her work, and in doing so increase our understanding of the history of women in Ireland. And indeed it does. What looking at Mary O'Connell gives us is an insight into the strong, fruitful, loving marriage in which a woman was the central support system to a public man. Mary O'Connell was no public woman. She was no radical like Mary Wollstonecraft, yet neither was she meek, passive, or voiceless. Outside of domestic matters, in letters to her husband, she expressed her opinion on political events. As Bishop notes, and I quote, Mary considered political issues in relation to their impact on those closest to her. She wished for emancipation because its achievement would rid her husband of the troublesome life he led and leave him with his family more than ever. Her opinion, Bishop says, were formed from a concern of the people involved, not from abstract rights of justice. And she defended her husband utterly when she felt he was under attack from those she felt should support him. She, and I quote, said, "How cruelly and ungratefully the Catholics are acting by you," she wrote. "Is it not enough that to make you retire from their service?" For Mary, Daniel and the support of Daniel was the centre of her life. For instance, when the Ellen Courtney scandal resurfaced in 1836, and at this stage, Mary and Daniel were living together, so we don't have too many letters from them, but she did go on a political tour with him of the English Midlands in April of that year, despite her declining health. This was, as Bishop said, most likely a show of unity and a sport in order to offset the scandal. We do not know if Mary actually believed Daniel had been unfaithful to her, and letters from their early period don't seem to indicate any anxieties or tensions about this facet of their relationship. And indeed, the letters up to the period of the early 1830s continue, even as they aged and their children were growing, to show a deep love for each other. Mary O'Connell came back to Derrynane in 1836 and died there later that year in October, aged just 56. She's buried in the O'Connell tomb on Abbey Island. Her husband would survive her by just over a decade, and he is buried not with her on Abbey Island, but in Glasnevin Cemetery. Perhaps it's a pity that such a united couple are buried separately. As a woman of her time, Mary can be seen as a success. She was in a loving, supportive marriage. She brought up 12 children, most of whom made successful careers for the boys and successful marriages for the girls. Despite the financial difficulties faced by the family, she ran a tight household. She was a private mainstay to her husband's political career and indeed gave him some advice. She was, by all measures of the early 19th century women, success. Her letters to and from her husband give us an insight into the world of this type of woman, a married woman, a domestic woman, the wife of a political man. The biography of Erin Bishop, which I would recommend to anybody, was published in 1999, and indeed it stands the test of time. But perhaps now it's time for a new look at Mary O'Connell and her life and her world and her marriage, her household, and her partnership with Daniel O'Connell. Thank you very much.
Before I introduce our third and final panelists in this session, I wanted to share with you the biggest gamble that we took when we were organising this conference. And when we were planning it all, and at this point I want to say what brilliant support we had from the Department of History and the head of the department, Professor Joseph Clark, the whole School of Histories and Humanities, and the head of the school, Professor Micheál Shukru, the whole team, Joanne, Stephen and Alberto. But the big gamble that we took at the very beginning is that we thought we didn't want a conference that was just about the life of O'Connell in the 19th century. Because we wanted to show to Ireland, to the world, that the ideals and principles of Daniel O'Connell influence later generations, and they continue to influence people today, and they still resonate and are important today. So that's why, if you look at the program of the conference, I'd say more than half the speakers are experts drawn from the area of human rights, areas where the ideals of Daniel O'Connell are still being fought for around the world. And we're so honoured to have speakers from Latvia, from the United States, from Ukraine, from the United Kingdom, but champions of those same ideals and principles as Daniel O'Connell. And last week I was at an event organised by the Bar of Ireland, one of our partners, and the Chancellor of the University of Dublin, the former President of Ireland, Mary McAuliffe, was speaking. And I have to say, she spoke more powerfully in 5 minutes than I think any of the rest of us could do in 50 minutes, talking about her love of O'Connell and what O'Connell meant to her. And indeed, she had her honeymoon in Derrynane because O'Connell and his ideals mean so much to her and her husband, Martin. She sends her regrets. She was fortunately not able to join us, but we will be videoing and filming an interview with her for our digital educational packs. But during the course of her talk, she spoke about how important O'Connell was in terms of peacemaking, but she spoke so importantly and powerfully about the legacy and the influence on John Hume, and how John Hume in the 20th century was very much the Daniel O'Connell of that time. And hearing her speak made me so delighted that we had invited an expert on John Hume to speak at our conference, Dr. Maurice Fitzpatrick. And Maurice is a Trinity graduate, he's a lecturer, he's a filmmaker, he's a writer, an historian. He produced that brilliant documentary and wrote it on John Hume in America, and the accompanying book that went with it won numerous awards. He's a hugely talented filmmaker and historian, but has this profound understanding of the legacy and the influence of John Hume. And I think it would have been a huge gap and missed opportunity if we had had a conference on Daniel O'Connell without hearing about his influence on later Irish nationalist leaders. And I think we would have to hear about his influence on John Hume.
Thank you indeed. It's an honour to be here. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I wish you well, Professor Geoghegan, in your new role as Director of the Hub. Thank you all for attending. Indeed, I would like to focus in my talk today on John Hume and John Hume in the tradition of Irish constitutional politics. And I think a good point of departure for a discussion on Hume in these terms is the achievement that made Daniel O'Connell iconic, about which we'll hear a lot over the next few days, Catholic emancipation. And when I began to formulate my thoughts for this talk, I asked myself this question: what did the concept Catholic emancipation sound like to a Catholic, particularly in Derry, Northern Ireland, growing up in the 40s and 50s? To address this, we have got an indispensable document in the form of 2 articles John Hume wrote for the Irish Times in 1964, called The Northern Catholic. The background to these articles was that a journalist, Michael McVinney, was sent north for a few weeks to do profiles, find out about Northern Ireland. This was back when Northern Ireland was like the dark side of the moon, a completely partitioned country as we had at that stage. And on his return, he recommended to the then editor of the Irish Times, Douglas Gageby, that he commissioned a few articles from this unknown school teacher in St. Columb's College in Derry named John Hume. Out of this suggestion came the Northern Catholic. 2 articles which I suggest have enormous historical importance. There's no overstating the degree to which Derry City at that time was caught in the crosshairs between the unionist system that completely isolated Derry, being a Catholic majority city, but heavily gerrymandered and completely isolated, as I've indicated already, from the Irish government and the connection with the South. And nevertheless, if you do suggest that you read the Northern Catholic articles, you'll find something dramatic is proposed in these articles, particularly dramatic from the perspective of a Northern nationalist. The only real alternative to the Unionist Party, the biggest other party, albeit a completely neutered and powerless party, was the Nationalist Party, and it was centred in Derry. And its big item on the agenda, its only item on the agenda really, was anti-partitionism. One needed to dismantle the partition of the country. That was a precondition to any form of political progress. Well, Hume argued against this in these articles, and he advocated what was an absolute heresy for a Derry nationalist, and said, what we need to do is accept the constitutional position. I'll read a brief quotation from this, if I can find it. He suggests that the position should be immediately clarified by an acceptance of the constitutional position. There is nothing inconsistent with such acceptance and a belief that a 32-county republic is best for Ireland. Such change would remove what has been the great stumbling block to development of normal politics in the North. Catholics could then throw themselves fully into the solution of Northern problems without fear of recrimination. Recrimination, of course, one can extrapolate from that accusations of being a traitor to the cause. This was 1964, and in the same year, RTE sent a group of filmmakers north to make a documentary, first documentary made about the appalling circumstances in Derry City. It was called Riarc in Derry. And what was remarkable about Riarc in Derry, it's well worth viewing. It's on the RTE website. What was remarkable about it was once it was made, RTE's senior management intervened to prohibit its transmission. The minute you make a documentary showing the circumstance of Derry, it's suppressed. And that was a decision of a core institution in Ireland at the time. 25 years later, it was eventually aired by RTE, and the premise of the panel discussion about the documentary was that indeed RTE had censored itself by not airing it in 1964. And a panel discussion ensued. Participants of that panel discussion included Eamon McCann and John Hume. But given that these things started to happen, like documentaries were being made, articles were being printed in the Irish Times, new voices were being heard, voices, I would suggest, of the newly educated generation of the Northern minority who had benefited from the 1947 Education Act, people like Bernadette Devlin, Eamon McCann, John Hume, who were demanding change within their society. But to go back to Hume, this change had to happen in a specific way, and he makes this clear also in the articles. He was, to his bone, a constitutionalist, and he was sharply aware that once political change was advocated within the structure of the Northern Irish state, there was the potential, pretty strong potential, of Northern Ireland, the authorities of Northern Ireland, the police, the government, to react violently to these proposals of change. One of his, Hume was a student first and then a teacher at St. Columb's College. And one of his teaching colleagues, James Sharkey, who later became an Irish ambassador, remembers the following, and I'm quoting. He said, James Sharkey said, I used to drop in at the back of his modern history class. It was clear that the great constitutionalists, Grattan, O'Connell, Parnell, for Hume were not simply admirable historical figures, but they were also exemplars on whom you could base political judgments and political approaches. So through Hume's reading of what the Irish constitutional leaders had achieved in the 18th and 19th centuries, he developed proposals for new political processes to be adopted in the North. And these could only be achieved, he advocated, through non-violence. Hume was advocating that people of his background should work within the framework of Northern Ireland. And that, as I've mentioned already, was, from some people's point of view, heretical. It was an inherently challenging position to advocate. But he did this in the consciousness of this constitutional tradition. As former Irish ambassador, again, Sean Geoghegan has argued, and I quote, Hume is a conservative in an Edmund Burke sense, and indeed, in the right theatre to talk about Edmund Burke, in that he has a keen sense that a community that rejects the framework in which they operate and that they don't have a sense of identity with the institutions governing them is an unstable community. When you superimposed the red lines of the different forces that at play in Northern Ireland, you got a very small area where a compromise might be found. Hume focused on that with great persistence. So we have here a portrait of a political leader who started with a very profound sense of what was possible within Northern Ireland. Inspired by the constitutional nationalists, but also sharply aware that Northern Ireland was its own particular milieu and it had its own history since partition. Remaining for a moment with Edmund Burke, it's worth recalling that in the Reflections of Revolution in France, Burke asserts, quote, "We do not draw the moral lessons we might from history. In history, a great volume is unrolled for our instruction, drawing from the materials of future wisdom from the past errors and infirmities of mankind." It would be easy in weighing that formulation to lose sight of the word moral. But for Hume, and again in his reading of Irish history, the word moral is absolutely central. He was sharply aware of the moral depravity of the Northern Irish state, but he was also sharply aware of the need to confront that with moral politics. Hume outlined in these articles that the Irish constitutional tradition had been passed down, and it was an important tradition, albeit in several senses of the word tradition. The word tradition, tradition from Latin, means a handing down, but it also means, quote, giving up. And in advocating that, Northern nationalists should modify their view on partition and instead change the sequence of their political ambitions, their political objectives, to work within the Northern Irish state, I think there's an element of not necessarily giving up, but reconfiguring nationalist priorities. Throwing down the gauntlet to would-be political activists, Hume asserted the centrality of an inclusive economic program to transcend the division. Quote, "Community activity in which all sections play their part can do nothing but create mutual respect and, above all, build the country with our own hands." What followed a few years later has been well documented. The sharp sense of exclusion felt by Northern nationalists, Catholics, formed itself into a civil rights movement, an extraordinarily successful one. And in this swell of discontent, they managed to find a mode to protest against the state through non-violence. As Professor Garrodo Toohey has characterized Daniel O'Connell's political movement as, quote, based upon popular support and the mobilization of the mass of the people, while yet being non-violent and orderly. This gave proof that excited politics did not necessarily have to be sanguinary. And if you go through some of the footage of the civil rights movement, which of course was fundamentally based in Derry, you can find sometimes Hume talking to typically young boys, teenage boys, and saying, have a bit of sense, don't be, he didn't want them to throw stones, he didn't want them to get violent, he was insistent upon the necessity for non-violence. Again, as has been very well documented, after a few short years, the momentum of this new political consciousness engendered by the civil rights movement was overwhelmed both by the deployment of the British Army and the violence it visited upon people, internment without trial, the formation of loyalist terrorist organizations, and of course the provisional IRA. Hume has been likened to that famous essay by Isaiah Berlin, the hedgehog and the fox. Hume has been likened to a hedgehog in that the hedgehog has always got one big idea. And I think that's true enough. And I think Hume's big idea was to broaden the Irish political equation, broaden it right out to include America and to include Europe. As the title of my film suggests, Hume did go to America in a very determined way. He went to the heart of political Washington. He cultivated a constituency first in the United States Congress and ultimately through contact with a succession of US presidents, starting with Jimmy Carter. He encouraged, I should add this as well, with the support of the Irish government and a particularly talented group of officials in the Irish Embassy in Washington, he encouraged senior politicians in the US to take a position on Ireland and to use their influence on Britain to, in turn, encourage the Unionists in the North to embrace a new, modern constitutional approach to addressing the ills of Northern Ireland, which he always maintained was fundamentally about a divided people. It wasn't a divided territory, it was a divided people from his perspective. The other form of internationalization that he embraced, of course, was Europe. Arguably, the single most important part of Hume's political thinking was to try to position Ireland within Europe. And maybe no surprise here, I'm in the process of making a film looking at what John Hume achieved in Europe. It was work he did with, at times, reluctant fellow unionist MEPs, members of the European Parliament. But he did encourage unionist MEPs to think differently about their identity in the context of Europe. He was greatly inspired by the region Alsace, historically a place fought over with Germany and France, and now it's right between Germany and France, and particularly the city of Strasbourg. He spoke often, and including in his Nobel lecture, about the importance of learning from this model of an area that had been, and a city that had been historically divided between two countries, and now it had embraced its bicultural, bilingual identity in a new Europe. And he said this was his vision. This is where we need to go. We've got a divided culture. We've got a divided people in Northern Ireland. We need to become as one of the regions of Europe. And he was uniquely well placed, being an elected representative from the Northwest, to advocate that. And in making this film, I'm discovering more and more through talking to French and German politicians in particular, with whom he worked in the Parliament, quite how effective he was, quite how inspired and lifted he was when he saw regions of Europe like Alsace that had come to occupy a different space. And he never ceased to advocate this. I'll give you an example of quite how early and quite how firmly he advocated Ireland in Europe. It's a short quote from a magazine some of you may be familiar with, Fortnight. He gave an interview to Fortnight magazine in 1971, remembering that 1971 was just 2 years before Ireland, using the term in its loaded sense, Ireland and the UK joined the European Economic Community. And Hume said to Fortnight the following: "It seems somewhat contradictory that each part of Ireland seems willing to participate separately in the planned integration of Europe, but not in the planned integration of this little island." That's a crucial point about, end quote, that's a crucial point about Irish integration in the context of European integration, which takes on a new dimension and urgency now post-Brexit. Ireland and UK joined and entered Europe 2 years later with scant discussion of how joining Europe by turns necessitated and facilitated integration on the island. It gives rise to the following paradox: that we joined separately an enterprise whose object was to erode that separation. The insular tendency within Ireland was at odds with the openness towards Europe, yet the embrace of the latter could ultimately cancel out the former. The gradualist political construction that Hume attempted to cultivate as an MEP contrasted with the instability and political failure of Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Okay, thank you. Well, that's my cue to move a little ahead. But in his writings, in his representation, he always advocated this need to build. In a debate, for example, with Conor Cruise O'Brien in 1977, he said the following, and Conor Cruise O'Brien's line in that debate was televised in RTE, the politics programme. O'Brien was essentially saying, well, we can't talk about unity, and we can't talk about alternatives to constitutional alternatives in Northern Ireland. And Hume's response was, well, quote, "Constitutional building is about creating the conditions in which people can opt in. And the British government, which is a sovereign power in the North, has a responsibility to set out its long-term objectives and to create the certainty as to where we are going. Those objectives must not be inimical to the interests of any side, and must be reasonable and must guarantee to protect the rights of all sides. And within that framework, there is no justifiable reason for any group to opt out, given that in opting out, they know the price of it." I'm going to conclude now and bring it back to the inspiration of O'Connell and try to ponder John Hume's legacy in light of that statesman whose 250th anniversary has assembled us. The fundamental drive to establish a mass movement for democratic ends is an inevitable parallel. Both underline suffrage as the precondition to take proper command of one's own political life. Yet, viewing their parallel lives in the vein of Plutarch, O'Connell made the repeal of the Union the keynote of his entire political life. Absent the achievement of that repeal, he's known in our history, he's synonymous in our history, as an emancipator. By contrast, Hume, as I've mentioned, in his first national intervention in 1964, made the repeal of another union, namely the Union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, explicitly not his mission. However, in the sweep of his political life, it's ungainsayable that he did more to remove the political disabilities engendered by that union, and thereby to dismantle the essence of the originary framework of Northern Ireland, and to bring Northern Ireland to the point in which people can democratically determine its and their own political fate. As with O'Connell's quest for repeal, so too with Hume's vision of an agreed Ireland. Some political advances will only be seen in the longue durée. For both leaders, the means were as important as the ends. Attempting to achieve these ends through violence was simply unthinkable. There's only so much we can elicit, I think, from statues, but nevertheless, as we approach the 5th anniversary of John Hume's death this Sunday, there is a sense that the careful and determined gaze from the busts of John Hume in the Parliament buildings in Ireland, Britain and Europe spectrally urge us and even inspire us to draw moral lessons from history. Thank you very much.